My name is DeAndre Washington, and I need to tell you something that'll probably sound crazy. I walked away from a $1 million drug operation overnight because God called me to something bigger. But before I get to the miracle, let me tell you about the madness. It was 2018, and I was running the most organized operation Atlanta had ever seen. Started from the bottom in Bankhead. You know, that part of Zone 1 where T.I. used to rap about, where the old Bowen homes used to stand before they tore them down. My grandmother's house on Baker Road was where it all began, where I learned that survival meant moving smart, not just moving fast. By the time I was 25, I had runners in every zone of Atlanta, 300 soldiers working for me from Bankhead to East Lake, from southwest Atlanta to Decatur. We weren't your typical corner boys selling dimes and nickels. This was corporate-level distribution. I had lieutenants managing territories, accountants keeping the books, and a supply chain that would make Amazon jealous. Zone 6 was my crown jewel. That's where Gucci Mane used to talk about in his music, over there on Glenwood Road and Cleveland Avenue. I had trap houses running 24/7, moving everything from weed to pills, and my people knew every cop's schedule, every federal surveillance pattern. The APD's Zone 6 precinct might as well have been paying me rent because I knew their operations better than they did. But I wasn't just some street dealer getting high on his own supply. Nah, I was studying these streets like a science. I had apartments in Colony Ridge where my accountants would count money, stash houses in East Point where we'd store product, and safe houses in Cascade where I'd meet with suppliers flying in from Miami and Chicago. The operation stretched from the Bluff, that rough area near downtown where the addicts would come to score, all the way out to Clayton County. The money was insane. I'm talking about $50,000 cash days, sometimes more. I had a house in Buckhead with a view of downtown Atlanta skyline, cars that cost more than most people's houses, and jewelry that could blind you from across Lenox Mall. But the real power wasn't in the money. It was in the respect. When I walked down Auburn Avenue or through underground Atlanta, people knew who I was. Police knew, judges knew, even some politicians knew. My operation worked because I treated it like a business. Every runner had a territory, a quota, and a direct line to management. We used encrypted phones, rotated locations weekly, and had lawyers on retainer for when things went sideways. The streets from Jonesboro Road to Candler Road, from Martin Luther King Jr. Drive to Memorial Drive. All of it was mapped out like a military operation. But success in the game comes with a price that compounds daily. The paranoia was eating me alive. Every phone call could be the feds. Every new face could be an informant. Every day could be the day when everything I'd built would crumble. I was making more money than I could spend, but I couldn't sleep more than 3 hours at a time. Even in my Buckhead mansion, I'd wake up checking every window, every sound, every shadow. The violence was getting out of hand, too. Rival crews from Zone 3 were trying to move in on my territory. Bodies were dropping on Simpson Road, on Donald Lee Hollowell Parkway, on Metropolitan Parkway. The news was calling it a drug war, and I was the general everybody wanted to take down. I had started carrying a gun everywhere. To church, yeah, I still went to church sometimes. To family dinners, even to sleep. My mama lived in a nice house in South Fulton that I'd bought her. But she couldn't even enjoy it because she knew where the money came from. My little sister was at Spelman College, getting a real education with dirty money. And the guilt was starting to weigh on me heavier than the gold chains around my neck. The federal heat was intensifying too. Operation Heatwave was what they called it. The feds working with APD to take down major dealers across the city. They'd already hit some of my competition, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for the king. My lawyers were telling me to be careful. My suppliers were getting nervous, and my own people were starting to look over their shoulders more than they were looking out for business. But here's what I didn't understand back then. When you're standing on top of a house of cards, you can't see how shaky the foundation is until it all starts falling down. And mine was about to collapse in a way I never could have predicted. I thought I was living the American dream. A black man from the hood who had built an empire, who had climbed out of poverty and was providing for his family. But what I didn't realize was that I was living a nightmare disguised as success, and God was about to wake me up in the most dramatic way possible. The night that changed everything started like any other night in the ATL. I was driving my Bentley down Peachtree Street, heading to a meeting in Midtown, when my phone rang. It was my right-hand man, Marcus, calling from one of our spots in College Park. "D, we got a problem," he said, and I could hear the fear in his voice. The spot on Old National got hit. Not by the police. By something else. "You need to get down here right now." But I had no idea that God was about to hit me with something bigger than any federal raid. Something that would tear down everything I'd built and replace it with something infinitely more valuable. The king of Atlanta's drug trade was about to meet the king of kings, and my life was about to change forever. I'll never forget October 15th, 2019. That was the night God decided to show me who was really in control of Atlanta's streets. I was driving down I-285, the perimeter, heading to check on one of my operations in Forest Park when my phone started blowing up like it was New Year's Eve. First call was from my lieutenant in Zone 6. "D, we got federal agents surrounding the spot on Glenwood. They got warrants, dogs, everything." Click. Second call from my girl running the books. "Baby, they just froze 3 of our bank accounts. The lawyers are saying this is bigger than we thought." Click. Third call from my cousin in College Park. "Cuz, you need to disappear. Word on the street is they got indictments with your name on them." Click. But it was the fourth call that stopped my world. My mama, crying so hard I could barely understand her. "DeAndre, baby, they got Keisha. They got your sister." See, my little sister Keisha wasn't in the game. She was a good girl, honor student at Spelman, studying to be a doctor. But the feds don't care about good and bad when they're building a case. They'd arrested her coming out of her dorm on the campus, claiming she was part of a money laundering operation because I'd been paying her tuition. I pulled over on the side of I-20, right there by the Candler Road exit, and for the first time in my adult life, I broke down and cried. Not because they were coming for me. I'd always known that was a possibility, but because my choices had destroyed the one person I was trying to protect. The feds had been watching me for 2 years, building a RICO case that connected me to violence from Bankhead to Decatur. They had wiretaps, surveillance photos, financial records, and enough evidence to put me away for life. But worst of all, they were using my family as leverage, threatening to prosecute my mama for living in a house they claimed was bought with drug money. That night, sitting in my car on the highway while Atlanta's lights twinkled around me like stars I'd never reach, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of running, instead of fighting, instead of trying to lawyer my way out of it, I decided to turn myself in. But first, I had one stop to make. I drove to that little church on Joseph E. Lowery Boulevard where my grandmother used to take me when I was a kid. Mount Calvary Baptist Church. It was past midnight. The church was closed. But I sat in that parking lot and did something I hadn't done in years. I prayed. But this wasn't some foxhole prayer, begging God to get me out of trouble. This was something deeper. Sitting there in my Bentley, with federal agents probably tracking my every move, I felt something I'd never felt before. The weight of every life I'd destroyed, every family I'd torn apart, every soul I'd poisoned with the drugs I'd pumped into Atlanta's communities. I thought about Mrs. Johnson from my old neighborhood on Baker Road, whose son had overdosed on pills my crew had sold. I thought about the teenagers in Zone 6 who were dropping out of school to work for me, trading their futures for fast money. I thought about the mothers in East Point who couldn't let their kids play outside, because of the violence my operations had brought to their streets. For the first time in my life, I understood that I wasn't some Robin Hood figure taking from the rich and giving to the poor. I was a predator, feeding off the desperation and addiction of my own people. The money, the respect, the power. It was all built on a foundation of destruction that reached from the Bluff to Buckhead. That's when I heard it. Not an audible voice, but something deeper than sound, clearer than any conversation I'd ever had. God was speaking to my heart, and he was saying, "DeAndre, I have something better for you, but you have to let go of everything you think you are to become who I created you to be." I sat in that church parking lot until sunrise, watching the city wake up around me. Commuters heading to work at the CDC, students driving to classes at Georgia State, families starting their day in communities I'd helped poison. And I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to turn myself in, cooperate with the investigation, and try to undo as much damage as I could. But more than that, I felt called to something I couldn't even name yet. It was like God was showing me a different kind of empire to build. Not one based on fear and addiction, but one based on healing and hope. I didn't have the words for it yet, but I knew my life was about to take a completely different direction. I called my lawyer from that parking lot and told him to arrange a meeting with the federal prosecutors. I was ready to confess to everything, testify against my suppliers, and provide information that would help dismantle the drug networks that were poisoning Atlanta's communities. My crew thought I'd lost my mind. The streets thought I was turning snitch. But I knew I was finally finding my way. The next 6 months were a blur of court hearings, cooperation agreements, and protective custody. I testified in federal court against suppliers I'd worked with, provided evidence that led to dozens of arrests, and helped the DEA understand drug distribution networks they'd been trying to crack for years. The defense lawyers painted me as a traitor, but I knew I was finally telling the truth. My sentence was surprisingly light, 5 years, with time served and good behavior putting me back on the street in less than 3. But those years in federal prison weren't punishment. They were preparation. God was about to show me what he really wanted me to do with the leadership skills, the organizational abilities, and the street credibility I'd built in the drug game. I spent every day in prison reading the Bible, praying, and planning for a different kind of life. The same mind that had built a drug empire was now focused on building something that would heal the communities I'd hurt. And when I walked out of that federal facility in 2023, I wasn't the same DeAndre Washington who had entered. I was about to become something Atlanta had never seen before. A former drug kingpin turned minister, using everything I'd learned in the streets to win souls for Christ. Those 3 years in federal prison weren't the hell I expected. They were the seminary I never knew I needed. I served my time at FCI Atlanta, and the irony wasn't lost on me. I was locked up in the same city where I'd built my empire, but now I was building something completely different. The first year was the hardest, not because of the other inmates. My reputation from the streets actually protected me in there. It was hard because I had to face what I'd really been doing to my community. When you're in the game, you tell yourself stories to justify it. I'm providing for my family. I'm giving opportunities to people who don't have any. The system is rigged anyway, so I might as well get mine. But in that cell, with nothing but time and truth, all those justifications crumbled. I started reading everything I could get my hands on. Not just the Bible, but books about addiction, about community development, about leadership and transformation. I realized that every skill I'd used to build my drug operation could be used to build something that actually helped people instead of destroying them. The prison library became my classroom, and the chapel became my training ground. I started leading Bible studies for other inmates. And I discovered that the same charisma and organizational skills that had made me successful in the streets made me effective at reaching souls. When I talked to gang members about leaving the life, They listened because I'd been where they were. When I counseled addicts about recovery, they trusted me because I understood the game from both sides. The letters from home kept me grounded and motivated. My sister Keisha, who had been released without charges, wrote to me every week. She'd graduated from Spelman and was in medical school, and she told me how proud she was that I'd found the courage to turn my life around. My mama sent pictures from her new job at a non-profit in Atlanta, working with families affected by incarceration. But it was a letter from Mrs. Johnson, the mother whose son had died from pills my crew had sold, that changed everything for me. Instead of anger or blame, she wrote about forgiveness. She said she'd been praying for me, that she believed God could use my story to prevent other mothers from going through what she'd experienced. That letter broke me down and built me back up at the same time. I started having what I can only call visions of what my life could look like after prison. I saw myself standing in front of congregations in Atlanta's toughest neighborhoods, sharing my testimony and calling young men away from the life I'd lived. I saw community centers where former dealers could learn legitimate skills, where addicts could find recovery, where families torn apart by the drug game could be healed. The chaplain at FCI Atlanta, Reverend Williams, became my mentor. He'd been a gang member himself before finding Christ, so he understood my journey in ways that traditional ministers couldn't. He taught me proper Bible study methods, helped me develop my preaching style, and connected me with seminary programs I could complete through correspondence. By year 2, I was basically running the prison's Christian ministry program. We had Bible studies in English and Spanish, recovery groups for addicts, and mentorship programs for young inmates who reminded me of myself at their age. The warden even started using me to help counsel new arrivals who were struggling with the transition to prison life. But the real transformation happened during my final year, when I was selected for a work release program that allowed me to volunteer at a community center in Southwest Atlanta during the day while returning to prison at night. Working with at-risk youth in the same neighborhoods where I'd once recruited runners showed me exactly what God was calling me to do. These kids knew who I was. My reputation from the streets hadn't faded. But instead of wanting to follow in my footsteps, they were curious about how I'd changed. I started sharing my testimony, not as a cautionary tale, but as a story of hope and transformation. I saw young men who were headed down the same path I'd taken start to reconsider their choices. One kid, Jalen, really got to me. He was 15, selling weed in East Point to help his grandmother pay rent. He reminded me so much of myself at that age, smart, ambitious, but channeling those gifts in the wrong direction. I spent months working with him, showing him that there were better ways to provide for his family, better ways to be respected in his community. When Jalen got accepted to Georgia State University on an academic scholarship, and when he told me it was because our conversations had motivated him to focus on school instead of the streets, I knew exactly what God wanted me to do with the rest of my life. I was going to start a church, but not just any church. I was going to plant something in the heart of Atlanta's toughest neighborhoods, something that could reach people who would never step foot in a traditional church. I was going to use every connection I'd made in the streets, every lesson I'd learned in prison, every skill I'd developed as a leader to build a different kind of empire. One that dealt in hope instead of dope, salvation instead of destruction. The day I walked out of federal prison, I had a business plan for a ministry that would transform Atlanta's most forgotten communities. I had seed money from legitimate investments I'd made before my arrest, connections with reformed gang members who could serve as outreach coordinators, and a fire in my heart that burned hotter than any ambition I'd ever felt in the drug game. I was about to show Atlanta what a real kingpin looked like. Someone who used their power to build up instead of tear down. Someone who turned soldiers into saints. Someone who proved that no one is too far gone for God's grace. DeAndre Washington, the drug dealer, was dead. Pastor DeAndre Washington was about to be born. Walking out of federal prison on December 15, 2023, felt like being reborn. Atlanta had changed while I was locked up. The gentrification had pushed deeper into traditionally black neighborhoods. The drug game had evolved with new players and new products, but the pain was still the same. Standing on those steps, breathing free air for the first time in 3 years, I knew exactly what I had to do. My first stop wasn't to check on old associates or reclaim territory. It was to that same little church on Joseph E. Lowery Boulevard where I'd surrendered my life to Christ. Mount Calvary Baptist had a new pastor, Reverend Jackson, who had heard about my transformation through the prison ministry network. He offered me something I never expected, a chance to share my testimony the following Sunday. That first sermon was rough around the edges, but it was real. I stood in front of maybe 50 people, mostly older church mothers who remembered me from the neighborhood, a few young men who looked like they were deciding whether to laugh or listen, and some families who had been affected by the drug trade I'd helped fuel. I didn't try to sound like a traditional preacher. I just told my story, the whole truth about what I'd done, how God had changed my heart, and what I felt called to do next. When I finished, a woman in the front row stood up. It was Mrs. Johnson, the mother whose son had died from pills my crew had sold. She walked straight to me, and I thought she was going to slap me or curse me out. Instead, she hugged me and whispered, "God is going to use you to save other people's children." That hug changed everything. If she could forgive me, if she could see God's purpose in my pain, then maybe there was hope for the ministry vision that had been growing in my heart. Within 6 months, I had started what we called Street Church. Not a building, but a movement. Every Sunday, we'd set up in different neighborhoods across Atlanta. One week in the parking lot of the old Bowen Homes site in Bankhead, the next week at Washington Park in the West End, then over to East Point or College Park. We'd bring speakers, chairs, food, and most importantly, a message that met people where they were. The congregation was unlike anything Atlanta had ever seen. Former drug dealers sat next to recovering addicts. Gang members brought their grandmothers. Police officers who had once arrested me now came to hear what I had to say. We had rappers and teachers, college students and ex-convicts, all united by the understanding that God's grace has no boundaries. My preaching style was unpolished, but undeniably authentic. I talked about redemption like someone who had experienced it, about second chances like someone who had been given one, about God's love like someone who had found it in the most unlikely place. I used street language when it helped people understand spiritual truths, and I wasn't afraid to call out the systems and mindsets that kept our communities trapped in cycles of poverty and violence. The real breakthrough came when I started the 300 Disciples program, a reference to my old network of runners, but now focused on discipleship instead of distribution. We identified 300 young men across Atlanta who were at risk of entering the drug trade, and we offered them something better: mentorship, job training, educational opportunities, and most importantly, a sense of purpose and belonging that didn't depend on illegal activity. The program worked because we understood the streets. We knew that you can't just tell someone to stay in school when their family needs money for rent. So we created legitimate income opportunities. A moving company that employed ex-offenders, a construction crew that trained young men in building trades, a catering business that gave people skills they could use anywhere. Marcus, my former lieutenant who had also found Christ while serving time, became my ministry partner. The same organizational skills that had made our drug operation successful now made our outreach efforts incredibly effective. We had teams working in every zone of Atlanta, building relationships with community leaders, partnering with schools and social service agencies, and most importantly, demonstrating that transformation was possible. The church grew rapidly, but not in a traditional way. We didn't have one building. We had influence throughout the city. Our services happened in community centers, park pavilions, high school auditoriums, wherever people needed hope. We baptized converts in pools, lakes, even fire hydrants that we'd open on hot summer days in neighborhoods where kids needed both cooling off and spiritual renewal. Media attention was inevitable. Local news stations did features on the ex-drug dealer turned preacher. National publications wrote about our unconventional ministry methods. But the real validation came from the streets themselves. Crime rates dropped in neighborhoods where we had active outreach programs. High school graduation rates increased among young men who participated in our mentorship initiatives. Families that had been torn apart by addiction and incarceration started healing. One of our biggest victories came when we partnered with the Atlanta Police Department on a violence intervention program. The same cops who had once been trying to arrest me were now working with me to prevent the kind of conflicts that had made Atlanta's drug wars so deadly. We used former gang members as peace negotiators, and we saw a 40% reduction in drug-related violence in areas where our program was active. But perhaps the most powerful transformation was personal. 3 years after my release, I married Jennifer, a social worker I'd met at a community event. She had known about my past, but chose to see my future. Our wedding was held at Washington Park, and the guest list looked like a United Nations of redemption. Former criminals and crime victims, police officers and community activists, all celebrating what God had done in our lives. Standing in front of that crowd, looking out at faces that represented every corner of Atlanta, from Buckhead to Bankhead, from Decatur to College Park, I realized that I had finally built the empire I was meant to build. Not one based on fear and destruction, but one founded on love, hope, and the transformative power of the gospel. Today, 5 years after walking out of federal prison, the 300 Disciples program operates in all 6 zones of Atlanta. We've helped over 1,000 young men avoid the drug trade, assisted hundreds of ex-offenders in finding legitimate employment, and seen countless lives transformed by the power of Christ. The same strategic thinking that made me successful as a drug dealer now makes our ministry incredibly effective at reaching people other churches can't reach. I still live in Atlanta, but in a modest house in a working-class neighborhood where I can stay connected to the community I'm called to serve. Instead of counting drug money, I count souls saved. Instead of managing criminal enterprises, I manage community programs. Instead of avoiding police, I work alongside them to make Atlanta safer for everyone. The streets that once knew me as a kingpin now know me as a pastor. The corners where I used to post up runners are now places where we post up prayer teams. The same influence I once used to spread addiction and violence is now used to spread hope and healing. When people ask me about my transformation, I tell them the truth. I didn't change because I got caught, and I didn't change because I got scared. I changed because God showed me that the same leadership gifts He had given me could be used to build His kingdom instead of destroying His people. The most successful drug dealer Atlanta had ever seen became the most unlikely minister the city had ever witnessed. And every Sunday, as I look out at congregations filled with people who represent every kind of brokenness and every possibility of healing, I'm reminded that God doesn't waste anything, not even the worst mistakes of our past. He can take a man who once poisoned his community and turn him into someone who brings healing. He can take someone who was part of the problem and make him part of the solution. That's the real miracle of my story. Not that I got out of the game, but that God got the game out of me and replaced it with something infinitely better. From 300 runners to 300 disciples. That's the kind of mathematics that only makes sense in the kingdom of God. If this story of radical transformation moves you, share it with someone who needs to believe that their past doesn't define their future. God specializes in turning mess into ministry, pain into purpose, and broken lives into powerful testimonies. No matter how far you've fallen, it's never too late for a divine comeback.